The first truck arrived on a Tuesday, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled slowly on the wild chicory lining the fence. It was Marcus Thorne's truck, a machine as polished and arrogant as its owner. In the back, lashed down with thick, greasy chains, was the rusted carcass of a John Deere 9600 combine harvester. Its colossal header was gone, but the main body, a hulk of faded green and sun-bleached yellow, looked like a beached whale surrendering to the elements. Thorne and his two hired hands unhooked the chains with practiced efficiency, the metal links clanking a dull, final rhythm. With a gut-wrenching groan, the machine was winched to the edge of the flatbed and shoved. It tipped, hung in the air for a moment of impossible silence, and then crashed onto the soft earth of the 5-acre plot, and its weight sending a tremor through the ground. The men laughed, a sound that was sharp and dismissive in the quiet afternoon air. Thorne wiped his hands on a rag, then sauntered over to the fence, where Elias stood watching, his expression unreadable. "There you go, Elias," Thorne said, his voice laced with a kind of pitying amusement. "First deposit in your new collection." He pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and held it out. "For the trouble." Elias looked at the bill, then at the dead machine, then back at Thorne. He made no move to take the money. "No charge, Marcus." Thorne's smile tightened. He clearly expected a negotiation, a haggling over the scrap value, something he could understand. This quiet refusal was unsettling. "Don't be a fool. It's got to be worth a few hundred in scrap." "The land is fallow," Elias said, for his voice as even as the horizon. "It needs something to do. This is a fine start." Thorne stared, searching for the punchline, for the hint of a clever scheme. He found none. There was only Elias, a man in his late 40s, with the patient eyes of a geologist, looking at a 10-ton piece of junk as if it were a sapling he'd just planted. Shaking his head, Thorne tossed the bill onto the ground inside the fence line. "Keep the change," he muttered, turning back to his truck. "Maybe you can buy yourself some common sense." The hired hands snickered as they climbed back into the cab. As the truck rumbled away, leaving another veil of dust, Elias walked through the gate and stood before the fallen giant. He didn't see a wreck. He didn't see scrap metal or a monument to failure. He ran a hand over a rusted panel, feeling the texture of decay, the history of 1,000 acres harvested, of sun and rain and mechanical stress. Everyone else saw an ending. They saw a problem to be disposed of. Elias, however, was looking at the beginning of a very different kind of harvest. He saw a library of parts, a dictionary of mechanical solutions, a complex system simply waiting for a new set of questions. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of a hydraulic fitting, his mind already beginning the long, slow process of cataloging. The money Thorne had thrown lay untouched in the grass, an irrelevant footnote to the transaction that had just taken place. The community, a small network of farms and businesses, bound by generations of shared struggle and gossip, noticed immediately. The arrival of Thorne's combine was the first pebble in an avalanche of speculation. Within a week, a broken-down hay baler from the Miller farm joined the combine, followed by a seed drill with a shattered axle from the Garbers. Each delivery was the same, a brief, almost theatrical display of dumping, a few condescending words for Elias, and the quiet, unnerving acceptance of the junk. He never asked for it, but when they offered, he simply designated a spot, as if he were a groundskeeper arranging sculptures in a garden. His 5-acre plot, a piece of prime agricultural land his grandfather had cleared by hand, began to transform. It was no longer a field. It was becoming something else, something for which they had no name. They settled on Elias's Folly. The name stuck because it felt right. It explained the unexplainable. Elias wasn't building anything, wasn't farming, wasn't selling. He was merely accumulating failure. His process was the most maddening part. He didn't attack the machines with a cutting torch, eager to extract the valuable metals. Instead, he would spend days, sometimes weeks, with a single piece of equipment. He would approach it not as a mechanic, but as a coroner performing an autopsy. With a set of worn but meticulously maintained tools, he would begin a slow, deliberate disassembly. Every bolt was coaxed loose, not sheared. Every wire was disconnected at its terminal, not cut. He moved with a reverence that baffled anyone who happened to watch from the road. They saw a man wasting his life on garbage. They couldn't see the system. After each component was removed, a pump, a gear, a length of wiring harness, a simple bracket, it was cleaned. The grease of its working life and the rust of its abandonment were carefully stripped away. And then came the ledger. It was a thick leather-bound book, its pages filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. Each part was given an entry. Part number 734, hydraulic pump. Source, JD 9600 combine. Condition, housing cracked, impeller intact. 3 of 4 mounting bolts salvageable. Location, Section C, Row 4, Bin 2. He created a cross-referencing system. A farmer might see a pile of identical-looking gears. Elias saw a taxonomy. Gears by tooth count, by diameter, by the hardness of the steel. He created a map of his folly, a grid system laid out with simple wooden stakes and twine. Section A was for engines and transmissions. Section B for hydraulics. Section C for electrical components. It was a library of mechanical potential, and he was its sole, tireless librarian. His neighbors saw chaos. He saw an intricate, three-dimensional database. The mockery was relentless but quiet, the kind of corrosive whispering that defines small-town judgment. He's got his father's melancholy and his grandfather's stubbornness, one would say at the grain co-op. A bad combination. Marcus Thorne was the most vocal. He's a disgrace to his family's name, he'd declare over coffee at the local diner. That land could be pulling in $100,000 a year in corn. Instead, he's farming rust. The irony, lost on everyone, was that Elias was indeed farming. He was planting seeds of utility and waiting with unimaginable patience for the right season to harvest. He never defended himself. He never explained. He simply continued his work, the quiet scratching of his pen in the ledger, a counterpoint to the hum of his neighbor's brand new, fully operational, and deeply indebted machinery. Like he was building an ark, one piece at a time, while everyone else was enjoying the sunshine and mocking the man who insisted on collecting gopher wood. This way of seeing the world was not born in him, it was taught. It came from his grandfather, a man who had weathered the Great Depression and 2 wars, not with wealth, but with a profound understanding of how things held together and how they fell apart. Elias remembered being 8 years old, standing in the cool, dusty air of the old man's workshop. The farm's main water pump had failed. For his father, it was a catastrophe requiring an immediate, expensive trip to the city. For his grandfather, it was a puzzle. The old man had laid the pump's components out on a clean burlap sack on the workbench. He picked up a small metal impeller its fins worn smooth. Everything in this world. Elias, his grandfather had said, his voice raspy like sandpaper on old wood, exists in one of three states. It is either working, it is broken, or it is waiting. He tapped the worn impeller. Most people see this, and they say it's broken. They see an ending. They throw it away. He then walked over to a cluttered shelf and returned with a small brass gear from a mantel clock that hadn't ticked in 20 years. But nothing is ever truly broken. It's just a system whose parts are in the wrong arrangement. The purpose is gone, but the potential is still there. He held the gear next to the impeller. This gear, he said, was part of a system for telling time. That system is broken. But the gear itself? It's not a time-telling thing. It's a piece of brass with teeth of a certain size, a hole of a certain diameter. It's just waiting. The lesson had lasted all afternoon. His grandfather explained that the world wasn't a collection of objects, but a collection of systems. A tractor wasn't a tractor. It was a system for converting chemical energy into torque. A clock was a system for measuring decay. And a scrap heap wasn't a scrap heap. It was a dormant collection of solutions, waiting for problems to solve. Waste, his grandfather had concluded, filing a piece of the clock gear to fit a worn shaft on the water pump, is a failure of imagination. He had fixed the pump with a part from a clock, a piece of wire from a defunct radio, and a seal he fashioned from the sole of an old leather boot. It wasn't a pretty repair, but it worked. It held. The water flowed again. That day, Elias stopped seeing the world as a collection of finished things, and he began to see it as a flowing river of components, constantly assembling into systems, breaking apart, and waiting to be reassembled into new ones. The combine in his field wasn't junk. It was 1,000 different parts, each one patiently waiting. The laughter of Marcus Thorne and the others didn't bother him because they were still living in a world of objects. They saw a broken combine. Elias saw the water pump, the clock, and the leather boot, magnified 10,000 times. He was not hoarding scrap. He was honoring his grandfather's most important lesson, that the state of being broken was merely a temporary illusion. The folly grew. The first year saw the arrival of 27 distinct machines. By the end of the third year, that number had swelled to over 100. The 5 acres were no longer a field dotted with metal. They were a dense, metallic forest. From the road, it was an eyesore of epic proportions, a testament to one man's descent into eccentricity. But within its borders, a meticulous order reigned. Elias's system had evolved. The ledger was now a set of ledgers, cross-referenced and indexed. He had added a new layer of classification, a color-coded tag system. Red tags signified components that were in perfect working order, salvaged from a larger failed system. Yellow tags meant the part was functional, but required minor repair or adaptation, a worn bearing, a frayed wire. Blue tags were for raw materials, a solid steel axle that could be machined into something new, a large plate of aluminum that could be cut and shaped. He spent his days in a slow, rhythmic dance of deconstruction and classification. The high-pitched squeal of a wrench turning a stubborn bolt, the soft thud of a component being placed in its designated bin, the rustle of pages as he made a new entry in his library of things. He was a scholar in a library of iron and steel. His knowledge became encyclopedic. He could tell you the gear ratio of a transmission from a 1982 Case tractor just by looking at its housing. He knew the precise hydraulic pressure rating for a cylinder salvaged from a Caterpillar excavator that had been burned out in a fire. He was not just cataloging parts. He was absorbing their stories, their tolerances, their potential. He was learning the language of the mechanical world. The other farmers, meanwhile, were speaking a different language altogether, the language of finance, of depreciation schedules, and trade-in values. And they operated on a cycle of use and disposal. When a machine broke, they consulted a spreadsheet. If the repair cost exceeded a certain percentage of its replacement value, it was discarded. Efficiency demanded it. Theirs was a world of just-in-time inventory, of parts ordered overnight from a regional distribution center, of problems solved with a credit card. They saw their machines as singular, monolithic tools. They had lost the intimacy with the gears and levers, the deep knowledge that had defined their grandfather's generation. They were no longer mechanics. They were operators. And in their world of sleek, disposable efficiency, Elias's painstaking preservation of the obsolete was the ultimate act of madness. By the 5th year, he had cataloged over 30,000 distinct components. His folly contained the mechanical DNA of nearly every major piece of agricultural and construction equipment made in the last 40 years. It was a sprawling, silent testament to his belief. And it sat there under the hot summer sun and the cold winter snow, waiting, just like his grandfather said it would. The first true test of his system came not from a crisis, but from a quiet, creeping drought. It was the 7th year of the folly. The summer had been brutal, a relentless siege of heat with no rain. The creeks dwindled to trickles, and the earth of the surrounding farms cracked like old pottery. Irrigation became a matter of survival. Elias's own water pump, the very same one his grandfather had repaired decades ago, finally gave out. A central valve, a complex piece of cast iron, had cracked under the strain. He went to the supply store in town. The man behind the counter, a young man who knew Elias only as the town eccentric, keyed the part number into his computer. He shook his head. "Obsolete, man. They stopped making this model 12 years ago. You'll have to replace the whole unit." A new pump system was thousands of dollars Elias didn't have. News of his predicament traveled quickly. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction for his critics. The great preserver of junk couldn't even maintain his own ancient equipment. Marcus Thorne, driving by and seeing the withered state of Elias's corn patch, felt a surge of vindication. He even pulled over one afternoon. "Having some trouble, Elias?" he asked, the feigned concern barely masking his glee. "Heard your pump died. You know, for what you'd make on one good harvest from this field, you could buy 3 of the best pumps in the market." Elias simply nodded, his face smudged with grease. "I'm looking into it, Marcus." The next morning, Elias did not drive to the bank to beg for a loan. He walked to his ledger shed. He flipped through the pages, his finger running down the columns. He wasn't looking for a direct replacement. He knew one didn't exist in his collection. He was looking for a functional equivalent. He was searching the grammar of his library for a different word that could serve the same purpose. He found a promising entry under Section B, Hydraulics, a flow control valve from a decommissioned crop sprayer he'd taken in 3 years prior. The valve's housing was different. The fittings were the wrong size, but its internal mechanism Its core principle was the same, and he spent the next 2 days in his workshop. He didn't just bolt the new valve on. He had to fabricate an adapter plate from a piece of scrap steel, blue tag raw material. He had to re-thread the fittings using a set of taps and dies that had belonged to his grandfather. It was a slow, meticulous process of adaptation, of convincing 2 disparate pieces of mechanical history to work together. On the 3rd day, he reinstalled the pump. He primed it, held his breath, and flipped the switch. For a moment, there was only the hum of the electric motor. Then, with a cough and a shudder, a thick, beautiful stream of water gushed from the outlet pipe. It wasn't a perfect solution. The pump ran a little louder. The pressure was a fraction lower, but it worked. The water flowed. His corn would survive. Now Marcus Thorne saw the sprinklers running the next day. He slowed his truck, staring. He couldn't comprehend it. It must have been a fluke, a lucky break. He dismissed it, convincing himself that even a fool stumbles upon a solution now and then. He failed to understand that it wasn't luck. It was the system. It was the first quiet proof that Elias's folly was not a graveyard. It was an arsenal. As the years compounded, the folly became less a joke and more a permanent, accepted feature of the landscape, like an odd rock formation. Children who had grown up with it couldn't imagine the field being any other way. The social pressure on Elias eased from active mockery to a kind of passive, head-shaking acceptance. He was no longer the town fool, but the town hermit, a man living in a world of his own making. Yet the official world, the world of regulations and ordinances, was beginning to take notice. A letter arrived from the County Planning Commission. It was polite but firm, citing a local ordinance regarding unlicensed salvage operations and public nuisances. It was instigated, Elias suspected, by a complaint from Marcus Thorne, whose own property value was, in his mind, being dragged down by the ever-expanding scrapyard next door. The letter demanded that Elias remediate the site within 6 months. It was a sterile, bureaucratic term for destroying his life's work. He attended the next town council meeting. It was held in the small wood-paneled community hall. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and self-importance. Elias, who hadn't spoken publicly in years, stood before the 5-member council. He didn't argue or plead. He simply tried to explain. "It is not a salvage yard," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "It is a library. It is an archive of mechanical solutions. Every piece is cataloged. Every item has a potential purpose." The council members looked at him with blank incomprehension. The chairman, a real estate developer, cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance, with all due respect, what we see is a 5-acre field of rusting junk. It's an eyesore and, frankly, a potential environmental hazard." Marcus Thorne was in the audience. He stood up, seizing the opportunity to perform his role as the voice of reason. "Elias is a good man," he began, the condescension dripping from every word. "But he's stuck in the past. We're a modern farming community now. We can't have this relic of a bygone era holding us all back. I have personally offered to help him clear that land at my own expense. It's time to move forward." The sentiment in the room was clear. They were on Thorne's side. They saw progress in the new, the shiny, the efficient. They saw Elias's folly as an anchor, a stubborn refusal to join their march into the future. The council voted to uphold the remediation order. Elias was given 180 days. He walked out of the hall into the cool night air, the deadline hanging over him like a death sentence. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt. Had his grandfather's philosophy been just a romantic notion, unworkable in a world that had no patience for the slow, the old, the waiting? He returned to his field, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows from the silent machines. He ran a hand over the cold steel of a familiar tractor fender. The system was sound. He knew it was. The world was just asking the wrong questions. He had 180 days. He would not spend them clearing the field. He would spend them working. He would continue his cataloging right until the very last day. His faith in the system was all he had left. The end came not from the county bulldozers, but from the evening news. It started as a minor story, a financial report from halfway around the world. A global shipping conglomerate, Triton Maritime, had declared a sudden and catastrophic bankruptcy. The news anchor spoke of over-leveraged assets and a liquidity crisis. To most people, it was abstract financial noise. But to the global supply chain, it was the equivalent of a massive, simultaneous heart attack and stroke. Triton controlled nearly a third of the world's container ships and, more critically, owned the port management software used by dozens of key international hubs. With their collapse, their ships were frozen mid-ocean, legally unable to dock. The ports that used their software went dark, unable to process cargo from any carrier. The intricate globe-spanning dance of just-in-time delivery came to a dead stop. In the first few days, the effects were minor, but the system was so lean, so devoid of redundancy, that it began to fray almost immediately. The initial reports were of shortages of consumer electronics and clothing. Then the stories turned to industrial components. A car factory in Michigan shut down, waiting for a single wiring harness stuck on a ship in the Pacific. The news was a low hum of background anxiety for the farmers in Elias's community. They were busy preparing for the harvest in the most critical and mechanically intensive period of the year. Their combines, tractors, and balers were tuned and ready. They felt insulated, their work tied to the land, not some distant port. The illusion shattered a week later. A freak hailstorm, a violent, localized squall, ripped through the county. It was a 10-minute cataclysm of ice and wind. When it was over, the damage was widespread. It wasn't just the crops that were battered. The storm had been powerful enough to damage machinery left out in the fields. Canopies were shredded, wires were snapped, and several critical gearboxes, their seals compromised by the force of the hail, had taken on water. The morning after the storm, the phones at every agricultural supply depot within a 500-mile radius began to ring, and the requests were all the same. A new transmission for a Case YH combine, a hydraulic manifold for a New Holland tractor, a set of planetary gears for a forage harvester. The answers were also all the same. Sorry, that part is on back order. We're not sure when we'll get our next shipment. It's stuck on a boat somewhere off the coast of Singapore. The global crisis had arrived in their fields. The abstract news report had become a devastatingly concrete reality. The harvest was 2 weeks away, and the machinery that was the lifeblood of their entire community was broken. There were no parts to fix it. Panic began to set in, a cold, quiet dread. For the first time in their lives, their money was worthless. They had the capital, but there was simply nothing to buy. And the system they had built their lives around, the system of immediate replacement and disposable parts had failed them completely. The first visitor was not Marcus Thorne. It was a younger farmer named Ben Carter, whose father had been one of the first to dump a broken manure spreader on Elias's land years ago. Ben arrived at dusk, his pickup truck idling nervously at the gate. He held a small, shattered gear in his hand, its teeth sheared clean off. It was from the steering mechanism of his only tractor. He approached Elias, his face a mask of desperation and shame. "Elias," he said, his voice cracking slightly, I know this is a long shot. They say nobody has one of these. But I remembered my dad telling me about this place." Elias looked at the broken gear, then at the young man's face. He saw no triumph, like only a problem that needed a solution. He nodded slowly. "Let's see what we have." He didn't consult the ledger for this one. He knew. He led Ben into the heart of the folly, to a section of shelving that held the disassembled components of an ancient Alice Chalmers tractor. He rummaged in a carefully labeled bin and produced a gear. It was identical. Ben stared at it as if it were a holy relic. How much?" he stammered, reaching for his wallet. Elias shook his head. "The price," he said, his voice calm, "is that you spend an hour tomorrow helping me sort through that pile of hydraulic hoses. I'm behind on my cataloging." The next day, 2 more farmers arrived. One needed a fuel injector pump. The other, a specific type of bearing. Elias found both. The price was the same: a few hours of labor, of participation in the system, and they were helping him organize the very library that was saving them. Then, on the 4th day, Marcus Thorne's gleaming truck appeared at the end of the lane. Thorne did not get out right away. He just sat there, watching as Elias and 3 other farmers worked together to hoist a small engine onto a stand. He was watching the heart of a new community being formed in the middle of his neighbor's junk pile. Finally, he emerged from the truck. He looked defeated. His pride, the engine that had driven him his entire life, had finally run out of fuel. His top-of-the-line, $500,000 combine, the crown jewel of his operation, was disabled by a single, shattered transmission component, a part no bigger than a dinner plate. "Elias," he said, his voice low, stripped of all its usual arrogance, "I need help." Elias finished tightening a bolt before he turned to face him. He simply looked at Thorne, waiting. "My combine," Thorne continued, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "A planetary gear in the final drive. It's gone. There isn't another one on this continent." Elias nodded. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked toward the ledger shed. Thorne followed him, his boots crunching on the gravel path Elias had laid. Inside, Elias ran his finger down a page. He stopped. "Case I, H2388. Dumped here 6 years ago. Your machine, I believe." He looked at Thorne. The engine was seized, but the transmission was intact. Section A, Row 12, Unit 4. The reversal was complete. The man who had mockingly thrown the first piece of junk onto the field was now standing, desperate, as Elias consulted the catalog of that same junk to save him. They walked together, in silence, to Section A. Thorne looked around, truly seeing the folly for the first time. It wasn't a chaotic mess. It was an ecosystem. There was a logic to it, a deep and profound order that he had been blind to. He saw bins of sorted bolts, shelves of labeled electrical starters, racks of carefully coiled hydraulic lines. It was the most advanced parts depot in the county, and its inventory was composed entirely of things he and everyone else had defined as worthless. Elias stopped before a large, tarp-covered assembly. He pulled back the heavy canvas to reveal the transmission of Thorne's old combine, resting on a sturdy wooden pallet. It was clean, protected from the elements. Elias had treated Thorne's trash with more respect than Thorne had. With a heavy wrench, Elias began to open the transmission housing. The other farmers who had been working nearby gathered to watch. There was no sense of gloating. No, I told you so. There was only a quiet focus on the task at hand, the problem to be solved. When the housing was open, the gears inside were revealed, gleaming with a thin coat of protective oil. They were perfect. Elias located the specific planetary gear set, carefully removed it, and handed it to Marcus Thorne. Thorne held the heavy, intricate piece of steel in his hands. It was his salvation. He looked from the gear to Elias, his eyes filled with a decade's worth of misjudgment. "What do I owe you?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Elias looked not at Thorne, but at the county remediation notice he had pinned to the wall of his workshop. So it had 142 days left on it. "You owe me a phone call," Elias said, "to the chairman of the town council. You're going to tell him that this public nuisance is the only thing keeping this town from starving. You're going to tell him that this is not a salvage yard. It's essential infrastructure." He then turned to the small crowd of farmers. "And all of you," he continued, his voice gaining a quiet authority, "are going to help me build a proper workshop, because the next crisis is always coming, and we're going to be ready." It wasn't a request. It was the establishment of a new order. The price of a part was no longer money. It was a commitment. It was belief in the system. It was the understanding that their survival depended not on what they could buy, but on what they had the wisdom to keep. Over the next 2 weeks, Elias's Folly became the bustling heart of the community. It was a triage center for broken machinery. Under Elias's quiet direction, the farmers became a team. The man who was an expert welder taught others. The woman with a knack for electrical systems repaired damaged harnesses. They were relearning the skills their grandfathers had known, the deep, intimate knowledge of the machines they depended on. They were rebuilding their world with the pieces they had once thrown away. The harvest came in. It was not a record year, but it was a harvest nonetheless. It was a victory snatched from the jaws of a complete and utter collapse. The combines, tractors, and balers, stitched together with parts from their own mechanical ghosts, rolled through the fields. They ran a little louder. They bore the scars of their makeshift repairs, but they ran. The Folly was no longer the Folly. People started calling it the library, or, more simply, Elias's place. The county's remediation order was quietly and permanently rescinded after a single, impassioned phone call from Marcus Thorne. The 5-acre plot was not just saved, it was designated a site of critical community importance. Elias himself changed very little. He was not a king on a throne of junk. He was still the librarian. He could be found every day, from dawn until dusk, working. He was now helped by a rotating cast of volunteers, farmers paying their dues by helping him catalog the endless stream of new arrivals. For the dumping had not stopped. It had changed. People no longer came to discard their problems. They came to make a contribution. They brought him their broken machines, not with mockery, but with a kind of reverence, an understanding that they were donating a book, to the most important library in the world. On a cool autumn evening, as the sun set over the harvested fields, Elias stood looking out over his domain. The chaotic pile of junk was gone, replaced by orderly rows of shelving housed in new, open-sided structures the community had built. It was a living, breathing institution, a testament to a different way of thinking. The world teaches you to see value in the new, the pristine, the whole. It celebrates the finish line. But the real power, the enduring strength, lies in understanding the pieces. It lies in the quiet, unglamorous work of seeing potential where others see only waste. The value was never in the junk itself. 1,000 broken combines are just 1,000 broken combines. The value was in the system, and it was in the patient act of cataloging, the imaginative act of cross-referencing, the faith in the principle that nothing is ever truly broken. It is only waiting for a new problem to solve, a new system to join, a new mind to imagine its purpose. Look around you, at the things you discard, the ideas you dismiss, the skills you let atrophy. Are they truly worthless? Or are they just waiting for you to build the right library? Are they waiting for you to develop the system to understand their hidden potential? The next crisis is always coming. The only question is whether you will be ready to harvest the solutions you once threw away.